On a freezing Tuesday morning in January 1983, Michael Davidson guided his FedEx delivery truck through the quiet streets of Arlington, Virginia, his breath forming small clouds in the cab as he checked addresses against his clipboard. The residential neighborhood seemed perfectly ordinary, with its neat brick townhouses and snow-dusted lawns, exactly the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. He had no idea that the package sitting innocently in his cargo bay would transform him from an anonymous delivery driver into a key figure in exposing one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Michael Davidson had driven for FedEx for 7 years, and in that time, he had developed the kind of automatic efficiency that comes from repeating the same tasks thousands of times. At 34 years old, he was the kind of employee managers loved, always punctual, never complaining, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to find addresses in neighborhoods where street signs seemed designed to confuse. His route covered a 12-mile radius of northern Virginia, from the commercial districts near the Pentagon to the residential areas where military families and government employees lived in comfortable anonymity. That particular morning, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and black ice made the roads treacherous. Michael had left the distribution center at 6:30 in the morning, as usual, his truck loaded with the typical assortment of packages ranging from overnight documents to irregularly shaped boxes that required creative stacking. He had approximately 73 deliveries scheduled for the day, and he prided himself on completing his route efficiently enough to be back at the depot by 4 in the afternoon. The package that would change everything was addressed to a residence on Oakwood Terrace, a quiet cul-de-sac lined with modest 2-story homes built in the late 1960s. According to his manifest, the package was destined for a Walter Brennan at number 42. Michael had delivered to Oakwood Terrace dozens of times before, though he could not recall ever stopping at number 42 specifically. The package itself was unremarkable, a standard rectangular box roughly 8 inches by 12 inches, weighing approximately 3 pounds according to the shipping label. As Michael turned onto Oakwood Terrace at 9:47 in the morning, he noticed immediately that something was different about number 42. While most of the houses on the street showed signs of morning activity, curtains drawn back, cars warming in driveways, the Brennan residence appeared completely dark and still. The driveway was empty, and snow from the previous night's light dusting remained undisturbed on the walkway leading to the front door. Michael pulled his truck to the curb and grabbed the package from the back. The cold bit through his FedEx jacket as he walked up the pathway, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He rang the doorbell and waited, stamping his feet against the cold. No answer. He rang again, counting to 30 in his head as company policy required. Still nothing. This was where protocol dictated his next steps. For a signature-required package, he should leave a delivery attempt notice and return the package to the depot for redelivery the following day. But Michael had learned through experience that many customers, especially those who worked government jobs with unpredictable hours, appreciated a little flexibility. He decided to try the neighbors. The house to the right, number 40, was owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who Michael had met several times before. She was a widow, probably in her late 70s, who always seemed delighted to have someone to chat with during her otherwise quiet days. When she answered the door, she was wearing a thick wool cardigan and held a cup of tea in her trembling hands. Michael asked, as he always did in these situations, whether she might accept the package for her neighbor. Mrs. Patterson's face took on an odd expression, something between confusion and concern. Then she said something that Michael found strange. She told him that she had lived on Oakwood Terrace for 31 years, and there was no Walter Brennan at number 42. The house, she explained, had been occupied for the past 8 months by a quiet couple who introduced themselves as Edward and Linda Morrison. Michael looked down at the shipping label again. The address was definitely number 42 Oakwood Terrace, Arlington, Virginia. The name clearly read Walter Brennan. He thanked Mrs. Patterson and walked back to his truck. intending to simply mark the address as incorrect and return the package to the depot. But something nagged at him. In 7 years of delivery work, he had encountered plenty of packages with wrong addresses, but they were usually off by a number or had the street name misspelled. This package had the correct address but apparently the wrong name. It seemed odd that someone would go to the trouble of shipping something overnight to a specific address, but put a name that did not match the residence. Michael sat in his truck with the engine running, staring at the package. The return address was listed as a law office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Schaefer and Associates. The sender's name was listed simply as K. Mueller. Something about the whole situation felt off in a way he could not quite articulate. He decided to do something he had never done before in his entire career. He decided to look a little closer. The package was sealed with standard packing tape, and the box itself appeared to be a generic shipping container, available at any office supply store. But as Michael examined it more carefully in the dim morning light, he noticed something peculiar. Along one edge of the box, where the tape met the cardboard, there was a tiny gap, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It appeared that the box had been opened previously, and then resealed with fresh tape that did not quite match the original seal. Michael knew he was not supposed to open packages. Federal law was clear about that, and FedEx policy was even clearer. But he also knew that delivery drivers were often the first line of defense against suspicious packages, and the early 1980s were a time when concerns about mail bombs and other threats were taken seriously. The gap in the tape gave him just enough justification to rationalize what he did next. He carefully worked his fingernail under the tape at the gap, slowly peeling it back. The box opened relatively easily, suggesting that whoever had resealed it had not been particularly concerned about concealing the fact that it had been opened. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a thick manila envelope. Michael pulled out the envelope. It was not sealed. Inside were approximately 40 pages of documents, all photocopies of what appeared to be technical specifications and diagrams. Even with his limited technical knowledge, Michael could recognize that he was looking at something related to military or aerospace engineering. There were detailed schematics showing cross-sections of what might be missile components, pages of mathematical calculations, and several documents that bore the marking "Confidential" stamped in red ink across the top. His heart began to pound. Michael had no special training in intelligence or security matters, but he had grown up during the Cold War, and he recognized the significance of what he was holding. These were not the kind of documents that should be floating around in the mail system, addressed to a name that did not match any resident at the delivery address. For several long minutes, Michael sat in his truck, the engine idling, trying to decide what to do. He could reseal the package, mark it as undeliverable, and let it go back through the system. He could deliver it anyway, leaving it on the doorstep of number 42 and washing his hands of the whole situation. Or he could do what every instinct was telling him to do, which was to report this to someone. The question was, report it to whom? The police seemed like the obvious choice, but something about the nature of the documents made him think this was bigger than a local matter. These appeared to be classified military documents, which meant this was potentially a federal issue. The FBI was the agency that handled espionage and counterintelligence on American soil. Michael carefully resealed the package as best he could and placed it back in his truck. Then he drove directly to a payphone he knew was located outside a convenience store 3 blocks away. His hands shook slightly as he dropped coins into the slot and dialed the number for FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., which he found in the phone book hanging by a chain from the phone booth. The call was transferred 3 times before he reached someone who seemed to take him seriously. Michael explained who he was, what he had found, and where he had found it. The agent on the other end of the line, who identified himself as Special Agent Thomas Garrett, asked Michael to describe the documents in detail. Michael did his best, reading off some of the technical terminology from the headers and describing the diagrams he could see. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Agent Garrett told Michael to stay exactly where he was and not to touch the package again. He said agents would be there within 30 minutes. They arrived in 22 minutes. 2 men in dark suits driving an unmarked sedan pulled into the convenience store parking lot and approached Michael's truck. They showed him FBI credentials and asked to see the package. Michael handed it over, his hands still trembling slightly from a combination of cold and nervous energy. Special Agent Garrett was in his early 40s, with the kind of methodical, observant manner that suggested years of investigative work. His partner, Special Agent Raymond Chen, was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, and had the athletic build of someone who spent significant time in the FBI's physical training programs. They examined the package carefully, flipping through the documents inside with the practiced efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. Agent Garrett looked up at Michael and said with careful neutrality that he had done the right thing by calling. Then he asked Michael to tell him everything he could remember about number 42 Oakwood Terrace and the neighbors he had spoken with. Michael recounted his conversation with Mrs. Patterson, explaining that she had told him a couple named Morrison lived at the address, not anyone named Brennan. Agent Chen wrote everything down in a small notebook, while Agent Garrett continued to examine the package and its contents. Then Agent Garrett asked Michael a question that made the situation suddenly feel much more real. He asked whether Michael had told anyone else about the package or what he had found inside it. Michael shook his head. He had not even radioed his dispatcher to report that he was running behind schedule, which he suddenly realized he was. His truck was equipped with one of the new mobile communication devices that FedEx had started installing, but he had not wanted to explain over an open channel what he had discovered. Agent Garrett nodded approvingly. Then he explained, in careful terms, that Michael had stumbled onto something that was part of an ongoing investigation. He could not provide details, but the documents in the package were indeed classified materials related to American defense systems. The fact that they were being mailed to a false name at a residential address suggested an active espionage operation. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. He asked what would happen next. What happened next unfolded over the following weeks with a speed and intensity that Michael could never have anticipated. The FBI had, it turned out, been tracking suspected Soviet intelligence activities in the Northern Virginia area for nearly 18 months. The Bureau had identified several individuals believed to be either intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy or Americans who had been recruited to pass information to the Soviets. But they had lacked the concrete evidence needed to make arrests or to fully map out the network. The package Michael had discovered provided that evidence. The technical documents inside were traced back to a procurement office at the Pentagon, where a civilian contractor named Denis Kozlov worked as a technical liaison. Kozlov, who was 43 years old and had held his security clearance for over 15 years, had access to exactly the kind of classified information contained in the package. The address on Oakwood Terrace, the FBI discovered through surveillance, was indeed occupied by a couple who called themselves Edward and Linda Morrison. But their real names were Anatoly and Svetlana Volkov, and they were intelligence officers working for the Soviet Union's GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate. They had entered the United States 3 years earlier, using Canadian passports under their assumed names, and had established themselves in the Northern Virginia suburbs, specifically to serve as a dead-drop location for receiving stolen intelligence. The name Walter Brennan on the package was a prearranged signal. When Kozlov needed to pass documents to his handlers, he would package them and ship them via a commercial carrier to the Oakwood Terrace address under the Brennan name. The Volkovs would know to watch for packages addressed to that name. After retrieving the package, they would photograph or copy the documents and then forward the originals to the supposed law office in Philadelphia, which was actually another safe house used by Soviet intelligence. This system allowed them to move classified information without ever meeting face-to-face, reducing the risk of detection. But the system had broken down in one crucial respect. On the morning that Michael Davidson was scheduled to deliver the package, Anatoly Volkov had been called to an emergency meeting at a Soviet diplomatic facility in Washington. He had expected to return home before the FedEx delivery time, but the meeting had run longer than anticipated. For the first time in their operation, no one had been home to receive a package at the critical moment. That small timing failure, combined with Michael's conscientious decision to check with the neighbors and his subsequent discovery of the document's nature, had exposed the entire network. The FBI moved quickly once they understood what they had. Over the course of the next 72 hours, agents executed coordinated surveillance operations on all the individuals connected to the network. They watched as Denis Kozlov arrived at work at the Pentagon, as the Volkovs went about their daily routines in Arlington, and as several other individuals, whose roles in the network had not been previously clear, made contact with various members of the spy ring. The surveillance was conducted with meticulous care. Teams of agents, working in rotating shifts, maintained visual contact with the targets around the clock. They photographed everyone who came and went from the Volkov residence on Oakwood Terrace. They monitored Kozlov's movements from his apartment in Alexandria to his office at the Pentagon. They identified a pattern of meetings at various locations around the Washington metropolitan area, meetings that appeared casual but occurred with suspicious regularity. One of the most valuable pieces of intelligence gathered during this surveillance period came from observing a meeting between Kozlov and an individual who had not previously been on the FBI's radar. The two men met at a coffee shop in Arlington on the morning of January 29, 1983. They sat together for approximately 37 minutes, apparently engaged in conversation over coffee. To casual observers, they might have appeared to be colleagues or friends catching up, but FBI photographers captured the moment when Kozlov passed a thick envelope to the other man under the table, a transfer executed with the kind of careful nonchalance that suggested practice and planning. The recipient was later identified as Raymond Tucker, a Navy lieutenant commander who worked in naval intelligence at the Pentagon. Tucker's access to classified information about submarine operations and naval capabilities made him an extremely valuable asset for Soviet intelligence. Further surveillance revealed that Tucker was not simply a courier, but an active participant in the spy ring, passing his own stolen documents through the network. He had been recruited separately from Kozlov, through different methods, but the two had been connected by their Soviet handlers to create a more efficient operation. Tucker's motivation appeared to be a combination of financial gain and a sense of professional grievance. He believed he had been passed over for promotion unfairly and harbored resentment toward the Navy leadership. As the FBI pieced together the network, they realized it was more extensive and sophisticated than they had initially understood. The Volkovs served not just as a dead-drop location, but as coordinators for multiple sources. They collected intelligence from Kozlov, Tucker, and at least two other individuals who were subsequently identified. They processed this information, determining what was most valuable and time-sensitive, and they communicated with their superiors in Soviet intelligence using a variety of methods, including coded personal ads in newspapers and prearranged signal sites around the Washington area. On February 3, 1983, exactly 9 days after Michael Davidson had discovered the package, the FBI executed simultaneous raids and arrests. Denis Kozlov was taken into custody at his office at the Pentagon. Anatoly and Svetlana Volkov were arrested at their home on Oakwood Terrace. 3 other individuals, including a Navy lieutenant commander and 2 more civilian contractors with security clearances, were also arrested at various locations around the Washington area. The raids recovered a staggering amount of evidence. At the Volkov residence, agents found a sophisticated photography setup in a converted basement darkroom, where documents were copied before being forwarded. They discovered coded messages, operational funds in cash, and detailed instructions for dead-drop procedures. At Kozlov's apartment, they found photocopying equipment and evidence that he had been systematically stealing classified documents for at least 3 years. The investigation revealed that the network had passed thousands of pages of classified information to Soviet intelligence, including technical specifications for American missile defense systems, information about satellite capabilities, details of nuclear submarine operations, and intelligence assessments of Soviet military capabilities. The damage to national security was significant, though the full extent would not be understood for years. Michael Davidson, meanwhile, found himself in a strange position. The FBI insisted that his role in uncovering the spy ring remain classified for operational security reasons. He could not tell his family, his friends, or even his employer the real reason why FBI agents kept showing up to interview him. FedEx management was told only that he was assisting federal authorities with an ongoing investigation and that he should be given full cooperation. For weeks, Michael continued his delivery route, maintaining the same schedule and covering the same neighborhoods, though now he could not help but look at every address with a more suspicious eye. He wondered how many other packages moving through the system might contain secrets and lies. He wondered whether there were other spy networks operating in plain sight, their activities hidden behind the mundane routines of suburban life. In April of 1983, Denis Kozlov pleaded guilty to espionage charges in a closed-door proceeding and was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He cooperated with investigators, providing details about how he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence during a business trip to Vienna 5 years earlier, and how the network operated. His cooperation helped the FBI understand the full scope of the operation and identify other potential security vulnerabilities. Anatoly and Svetlana Volkov, being foreign intelligence officers, were not prosecuted. Instead, they were declared persona non grata and deported back to the Soviet Union as part of a diplomatic exchange. The FBI suspected they would face consequences from their own government for the operational failure that had exposed the network, but American intelligence never learned what became of them after they left the United States. The other 3 individuals arrested in connection with the spy ring each received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The Navy lieutenant commander was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged before beginning his prison term. His betrayal was considered particularly egregious because he had volunteered for service and then violated the trust placed in him. Throughout the legal proceedings, Michael Davidson's name never appeared in public records. The FBI and the Justice Department maintained strict secrecy about how the spy ring had been discovered, citing the need to protect investigative methods and sources. Officially, the breakthrough in the case was attributed to routine counterintelligence work and diligent investigation by federal agents. But within the FBI's counterintelligence division, Michael's role was well known and deeply appreciated. In June of 1983, he was invited to FBI headquarters in Washington for what he was told would be a brief meeting. Instead, he was ushered into a conference room where he met Deputy Director of the FBI, who personally thanked him for his vigilance and patriotic action. Michael was presented with a letter of commendation, which he was told he could never show to anyone outside his immediate family, and a modest financial reward for his assistance. The Deputy Director explained to Michael something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He said that counterintelligence work was often won or lost on tiny details, on moments when ordinary people made the choice to pay attention and to act on what they observed. Most espionage, he explained, was not dramatic or obvious. It was mundane and bureaucratic, hidden in plain sight, and it was defeated by people who simply decided to ask questions when something seemed wrong. Michael returned to his delivery route, and life gradually returned to normal. The FBI eventually lifted most of the secrecy restrictions on his involvement, though they asked him to refrain from seeking publicity or discussing operational details. Michael was perfectly happy to comply. He had never sought recognition and felt uncomfortable with the idea of being treated as any kind of hero, but the experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He had learned that the Cold War was not just something that happened in distant countries or in the realm of international diplomacy. It was happening in suburban neighborhoods in Virginia, in office buildings in Washington, and in the everyday flow of mail and packages that moved through the American postal system. He had learned that vigilance mattered, that small actions could have enormous consequences, and that ordinary people, through simple acts of attention and responsibility, could play crucial roles in protecting national security. These were lessons that Michael carried with him for the rest of his career and his life. In the years that followed, Michael continued working for FedEx until his retirement in 2005. He never encountered another espionage network in his deliveries, though he often wondered whether he might have simply not noticed one. The thought kept him attentive to details and conscious of the hidden currents that might flow beneath the surface of everyday life. The spy ring that Michael helped uncover became, within the intelligence community, a case study in both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of American security during the Cold War. It demonstrated how persistent and sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations were, how they exploited access points within the American government and defense establishment, and how they used cover and concealment to operate undetected for years. But it also demonstrated the resilience of American society and the effectiveness of security measures when ordinary citizens remained aware and responsible. The network had operated successfully for years, but it had been brought down not by some dramatic intelligence breakthrough or high-tech surveillance, but by a delivery driver who noticed something odd and decided to make a phone call. The broader context of the case reflected the intense intelligence struggle that characterized the final years of the Cold War. By 1983, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in competition for nearly 4 decades. Both sides had developed extensive intelligence capabilities, and both engaged in aggressive efforts to penetrate each other's military and political establishments. The period from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s saw a significant increase in Soviet espionage activities in the United States, driven partly by the Soviet Union's determination to keep pace with American advances in military technology, and partly by internal pressures within Soviet intelligence agencies to demonstrate their effectiveness. The GRU and the KGB, the two main Soviet intelligence organizations, competed with each other to recruit sources and gather intelligence, sometimes leading to overlapping and redundant operations. American counterintelligence, for its part, had become increasingly sophisticated by the early 1980s. The FBI's counterintelligence division had learned hard lessons from previous cases and had developed better methods for detecting and tracking foreign intelligence operations. But the sheer scale of the challenge was enormous. The Washington area alone was home to dozens of foreign embassies, thousands of foreign nationals, and countless Americans with access to classified information. The case also highlighted the human element in espionage. Denis Kozlov, like many Americans who betrayed their country during the Cold War, was not motivated primarily by ideology. According to his later statements to investigators, he had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives and psychological manipulation. The Soviets had identified him as a person with access to valuable information, with financial pressures, and with certain personality traits that made him susceptible to recruitment. Kozlov's background revealed a man who had seemed, on the surface, to be exactly the kind of reliable employee that government contractors valued. He had graduated from Pennsylvania State University in 1962 with a degree in aerospace engineering. He had served honorably in the Air Force for 4 years, earning commendations for his technical work on aircraft systems. After his military service, he had transitioned smoothly into civilian contracting work, obtaining his security clearance without difficulty in 1968. For years, Kozlov had been exactly what he appeared to be, a competent engineer who did solid work and caused no problems. But by the late 1970s, his personal life had begun to unravel. His marriage was failing, eventually ending in a bitter divorce that left him with substantial financial obligations. He had developed a gambling problem, making regular trips to Atlantic City, where he consistently lost more than he could afford. His salary, while decent, was not enough to cover his alimony payments, his mounting debts, and his continued gambling losses. It was during one of his Atlantic City trips in the spring of 1978 that Kozlov had been approached by a man who introduced himself as a business consultant interested in technical information about aerospace systems. The approach had been carefully calibrated. The man, who Kozlov would later learn was a Soviet intelligence officer operating under commercial cover, did not ask for classified information at first. Instead, he offered to pay $500 for information about general trends in aerospace engineering, the kind of information that could be found in technical journals and industry publications. Kozlov, desperate for money and rationalizing that he was not really doing anything wrong, agreed. He provided the information and received his payment. 2 weeks later, the same man contacted him again, this time offering $1,000 for slightly more specific information about defense contractor capabilities. Again, Kozlov told himself he was not crossing any real lines. The information was not technically classified, just sensitive. Over the following months, the requests became progressively more specific, and the payments became larger. By the time Kozlov was being asked to provide actual classified documents, he was already receiving regular payments totaling several $1,000s per month, money he had come to depend on to maintain his lifestyle and service his debts. The Soviet handler had skillfully created a situation where Kozlov felt he could not refuse without jeopardizing his financial survival and potentially exposing what he had already done. They had approached him gradually, first offering to pay for information that seemed relatively innocuous, then slowly increasing both their demands and their payments, until Kozlov found himself deeply entangled in a relationship he could not easily escape. By the time he fully understood that he was committing treason, he was already so compromised that he felt he had no choice but to continue. The psychological trap had been perfectly constructed, exploiting his weaknesses while providing him with rationalizations that allowed him to continue believing he was not really a traitor. This pattern of gradual recruitment and escalating commitment was common in Cold War espionage. It reflected sophisticated psychological understanding and patient operational planning. The Soviets were willing to invest years in developing a single source, recognizing that valuable intelligence was worth the long-term effort. For Michael Davidson, learning these details in the months after the arrests helped him understand the significance of what he had discovered. He had not simply found a package with documents inside. He had interrupted a carefully constructed intelligence operation that had been years in the making and that had already caused substantial damage to American security. The realization was both sobering and oddly empowering. Michael had lived most of his life as an ordinary person doing ordinary work, and he had been content with that. But the events of January 1983 had shown him that ordinary people could find themselves at critical junctures, moments when their choices mattered in ways far beyond their normal sphere of influence. He thought often about the chain of small decisions that had led to the exposure of the spy ring. If he had simply left a delivery notice and driven away, the package would have eventually been picked up by the Volkovs, and the network would have continued operating. If Mrs. Patterson had not been home or had not known her neighbors' names, he might never have realized anything was wrong. If the package had been sealed more carefully, he might never have looked inside. Any one of these small variations could have changed the outcome completely. The spy ring might have continued operating for years more, passing additional secrets to the Soviet Union, potentially compromising American security at critical moments in the Cold War competition. Instead, a series of minor accidents and decisions had brought it to an end. In this sense, Michael's story illustrated a larger truth about how history unfolds. Major events are often determined not by grand strategies or inevitable forces, but by accumulations of small moments, by individuals making choices in situations where they cannot possibly know all the implications of their actions. Michael had simply tried to do his job well and had paid attention when something seemed wrong. That simple combination of competence and awareness had been enough to make a difference. The case also had implications for how intelligence agencies thought about security and counterintelligence. The fact that a delivery driver had been the one to uncover the spy ring prompted reviews of security procedures and discussions about how to better integrate everyday observations into counterintelligence efforts. The FBI began developing programs to educate postal workers, delivery drivers, and others in positions where they might encounter suspicious materials about what to look for and how to report concerns. These programs recognized that counterintelligence could not rely solely on professional intelligence officers and sophisticated technical surveillance. It also needed the eyes and ears of ordinary citizens going about their daily work, people who were in positions to notice anomalies that might escape more focused attention. For the Soviet Union, the exposure of the network in Northern Virginia was a significant operational failure, but it was far from their only espionage effort in the United States. Other networks continued to operate, and Soviet intelligence agencies continued their aggressive pursuit of American secrets until the end of the Cold War. But each exposed network made the work of remaining networks more difficult and increased the overall cost and risk of intelligence operations. The Cold War itself would continue for another 6 years after the events of January 1983. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union would intensify in some ways during the mid-1980s before beginning to wind down toward the end of the decade. Soviet intelligence operations would continue throughout this period, though with increasing difficulties, as American counterintelligence became more effective and as internal problems within the Soviet Union began to undermine the entire Soviet system. When the Cold War finally ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, many secrets emerged about the extent and nature of Soviet espionage during the preceding decades. Some of these revelations were surprising even to intelligence professionals who had spent their careers fighting the intelligence war. The scope and persistence of Soviet efforts had been even greater than most Americans realized, but equally significant were the stories of how those efforts had been detected, disrupted, and defeated. Alongside tales of sophisticated surveillance and clever counterintelligence operations were simpler stories of ordinary people who had noticed something wrong and had taken action. Michael Davidson's contribution was one among many, but it was representative of a larger pattern. In 2008, 25 years after the events that had transformed his understanding of his own significance, Michael attended a reunion of people who had been involved in major counterintelligence cases during the Cold War. The event was organized by the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and was held at a hotel in Northern Virginia, not far from where Michael had made his fateful delivery in 1983. He met retired FBI agents who had worked on the case, other civilians who had played various roles in different counterintelligence operations, and even a few former intelligence officers who had defected from the Soviet Union and had provided information to American authorities. The conversations were remarkable for their blend of normal professional reminiscence and extraordinary historical significance. What struck Michael most forcefully at this gathering was how many of the people present had similar stories to his own. They were people who had been in the right place at the right time and had made choices that seemed small in the moment but had turned out to have major consequences. A secretary who had noticed unusual copying patterns. A maintenance worker who had observed suspicious behavior in a restricted area. A bank teller who had reported odd financial transactions. None of these people were intelligence professionals. None had special training or authority. They were simply individuals who had paid attention, who had trusted their instincts when something seemed wrong, and who had been willing to take the risk of reporting their concerns to the proper authorities. During the reunion, one of the retired FBI officials gave a speech in which he reflected on the nature of the Cold War intelligence struggle and the role that ordinary citizens had played in it. He noted that while much attention was paid to the work of intelligence agencies and their officers, the reality was that citizens were the foundation of security. A society could not be kept safe by its government alone. It required the participation of its people, their awareness and their willingness to take responsibility for the security of their community. Michael found this perspective both validating and humbling. He had never thought of himself as particularly heroic or exceptional. He had simply been a man trying to do his job well, who had stumbled onto something important. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps effective security depended not on everyone being exceptional, but on ordinary people being attentive and responsible in their ordinary roles. As the evening concluded, Michael found himself in conversation with Thomas Garrett, the FBI agent who had been the first to respond to his phone call in 1983. Garrett, now retired and in his 70s, remembered the case vividly. He told Michael that the investigation that followed Michael's discovery had been one of the most satisfying of his career, because it had demonstrated that the system could work, that vigilance was rewarded, and that patient, careful investigative work could unravel even sophisticated intelligence operations. Garrett also shared something that Michael had not known. The classified documents in the package Michael had intercepted had included information about new radar systems being developed to detect Soviet bombers and missiles. If that information had reached Soviet intelligence, it could have allowed them to develop countermeasures that would have reduced the effectiveness of these defense systems. The potential consequences, in the event of a conflict, could have been catastrophic. By intercepting that one package, Michael had prevented damage that might have altered the strategic balance during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. It was impossible to quantify exactly what difference it had made, but the difference was real and potentially enormous. Michael left the reunion with a renewed appreciation for the significance of what had happened so many years earlier. He also left with a deeper understanding of how history works, how large events are built from countless small actions, and how the choices of individuals, even in seemingly minor situations, can ripple outward to affect the course of nations and the fate of millions of people. In the final years of his life, Michael occasionally spoke to students and civic groups about his experience, always emphasizing the same themes. He talked about the importance of paying attention, of trusting your instincts, and of being willing to take action when something seems wrong. He stressed that citizenship was not just about voting or following laws, but about taking active responsibility for the well-being of society. He also talked about the Cold War itself, helping younger generations understand what it had been like to live in a time when the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over every day. When the United States and the Soviet Union competed for supremacy across the globe, and when the struggle between freedom and totalitarianism seemed to define the meaning of human existence. Michael Davidson passed away in 2017 at the age of 68. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he had worked for FedEx for 37 years and that he had been involved in an important FBI investigation during the 1980s, though it did not provide details. Most of the people who attended his funeral had no idea of the role he had played in Cold War history. But within the counterintelligence community, his contribution was remembered and honored. The story of the FedEx driver who uncovered a Soviet spy ring became part of the training materials used to teach new agents about the importance of being receptive to information from all sources and about the ways that ordinary citizens could contribute to national security. The case files from the investigation, eventually declassified with heavy redactions, became available to researchers and historians studying Cold War espionage. Scholars analyzing the intelligence struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union would occasionally come across references to the Northern Virginia spy ring and to the unusual circumstances of its discovery. In this way, Michael Davidson's moment of decision on a cold January morning in 1983 became part of the permanent record of the Cold War, a small but significant episode in the larger story of how the United States and its allies maintained their security and eventually prevailed in the long struggle against Soviet communism. The story served as a reminder that heroism often wears ordinary clothes, that significance often emerges from routine, and that the security of a nation depends ultimately not on sophisticated weapons or clever strategies alone, but on the character and attentiveness of its people. In the grand narrative of the Cold War, with its nuclear arsenals and proxy conflicts and ideological confrontations, the tale of a delivery driver who looked twice at a suspicious package might seem minor, but in its own way, it was as important as any single action taken during those decades of tension and competition. Michael Davidson had been an ordinary man who found himself at an extraordinary moment. He had made the right choice, the choice to pay attention and to act on what he observed, and in doing so, he had helped protect his country and contributed to the eventual victory of freedom over tyranny. It was a simple story, but simplicity did not diminish its significance. Sometimes the most important acts in history are the simplest ones, performed by people who never sought fame or recognition but who simply tried to do what was right. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.